So here we are continuing our summer series, taking the story with you wherever you go. I've said that the story of the Bible is the story of God coming to earth to make his home with his people forever. And chapter 2 that we're going to look at today is the fall, or the fall into sin. Now, what happened in the fall? We've looked at God creating humanity in his image. We've looked at God's intention for rest and how we would live in connection with him forever. But what happens in the fall? Adam and Eve meet a snake and eat some fruit. It doesn't seem that big a deal. So what are we missing? If you've ever read a story, then you know that at the beginning or near the beginning, you have this inciting action or the initial conflict. The thing that goes wrong that explains why the rest of the story has to happen and how the author is going to make it right, or how, more importantly, the main character is going to make it right. And before we get into a definition of sin, here's the trick, not the trick, but here's the issue with sin. One of the things that sin does is it makes us think that everything's all about us. So perhaps we think that the Bible is all about people and all about, sure, God's people, but we might like to trace our spiritual ancestry back to Adam and Eve and think to ourselves that this is a story about us. And while that's not entirely wrong, there's a good impulse there. I've said before, just a minute ago, that the Bible is a story about God. God is the main character who comes to earth to make his home with his people forever. That includes us, and it's good news for us, but the story is all about what God is doing. The focus, God is the main character. He's the focus. And that matters when we talk about sin. Because what we've already seen is that God made Eden as this beautiful temple paradise, this garden temple, and he put his people, he put his images in it, such that if anybody wanted to look and wonder what God looks like or how God is, they needed only to look at people made in God's image, and they would have some sense of what God looks like. Maybe you grew up in a house where one or another of your parents said to you, "It's my house and my rules." Well, that's one of the things that we see in Genesis. God made this beautiful garden temple. God made people in his image. And God designed the world, the cosmos, and designed us to live his way, to live by his rules, and to live, as it were, in his house. He made us to live with him. And of course, what sin is about, what the fall is about, is Adam and Eve saying to God, no thanks. They want God's good name, they want God's power, they want God's goodness, but they want it without God. They want to live in God's creation, but not live by God's rules. They want to have God's power and his goodness, but they want it for themselves. They don't want to have it from God or in God's way. That's what happens in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve listen to the words of the tempter who says, "Did God really say you shouldn't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil?" The challenge of sin is a challenge of allegiance. It's not first doing one thing wrong or another and having to say that you're sorry. The question is, who is in charge of your life? Who's the main character? Who's determining how the story of your life goes, what your priorities are, who and what you're formed and shaped by, and what you're putting your energy into? And the challenge of sin is not so much that we entirely reject God and live for ourselves, although apart from God or before we know God, we do that. But as people who call ourselves Christians, who know this story and who carry it with us, most often the challenge is divided allegiance. We want to serve God and money. We want to serve God and ourselves. We want to serve God and some other tradition or priority or interest. And Jesus says you cannot have two masters. But the problem of sin is we so often try, just as Adam and Eve did in the garden. We want the goodness, the power, and the authority of God, but we want to be the main character. One of the main problems, one of the main outworkings of sin, the fall into sin that we see in the Old Testament and the New, is this problem of idolatry. Again, sitting in 2026, we imagine that it seems a little silly to carve something out of wood or stone or form something out of metal and then start praying to it. That just doesn't compute with our modern sensibilities. But the issue of idolatry is not an issue of carved images. The issue of idolatry is a question of allegiance. The Old Testament works this out in language that, again, is pretty unfamiliar to us. The language of idolatry, which continues through to the New Testament. It's familiar to us because sitting here in 2026, it doesn't make sense to us to carve something out of wood or carve something out of stone or form something out of precious metal and then talk to it or bow down to it or pray to it. And that's to say nothing of the fact that I'm recording this on a phone, and many of us spend far too much time staring at something that is made out of metal and silicon and I don't know what else, microconductors. But metal and silicone and microconductors make a whole lot more sense to us in 2026 than wood and stone and bronze. Be that as it may, the problem of idolatry is not a problem of forming things out. It's not a problem of the idols themselves or the images themselves. The problem is where our hearts are, where our orientation is. What are we putting our energy into? And what is determining who we become? Maybe you've seen images of people and their dogs that the more they spend time together, the more they look alike. Or husband and wife who are married and after a while start dressing alike or behaving alike or sharing the same words or even looking the same. That's the same idea with God. This idea that you are what you worship. That what you spend your time and energy pouring yourself into, you become more and more like that thing or that person. That it forms and shapes you back. And so someone who spends all their time on a phone or on a computer indoors kind of has to blink and find their bearings when they go outside into unfamiliar territory. Likewise, someone who spends all their time in warm climates comes to Calgary and feels very cold just about all the time. Or someone who lives in Calgary, as I have for the last 5 years, goes to Michigan of all places and gets a sunburn in Michigan. It's not even that nice there. But you are what you worship. Where you are, that who you spend time with, where you spend your time, forms you and shapes you in all kinds of simple ways, like the climate, but in far more profound ways as well, like your emotions, your spirit, and your inner being. The issue of idolatry is an issue of who is in charge, who is doing the forming, who is doing the shaping. And as we've said, in God's house, it's God's rules and God's way. This is why when Jesus is born and lives and preaches and gathers disciples around him, one of the key things he says in his ministry is, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus came to show God's people how to find our way back to him, how to be formed and shaped once again by our relationship with God, how to meet God here on earth and have him be the thing, him be the person who directs our life, who we orient our life around and in relation to. One of the interesting places this happens in the New Testament is when the Pharisees come to Jesus and they offer him a test. And in one of the Gospels, this happens just after Jesus gets a fish, gets a fish, and out of the fish's mouth pulls a denarius in order to pay the temple tax. Now, we miss one of the key things that's going on in this story, because Jews, observant Jews, especially the Pharisees, had a problem with coins like denarii, Roman coins, because they had an image of Caesar on them. It was like carrying around an idol in your pocket, an image of another god, when you're supposed to be devoted to the one true God. And so Jesus offers this denarius to them when they ask him about paying taxes to Caesar. Jesus shows them the image, and what we miss is that it's an idol in their eyes. It has an image of a false god on it, and there's all kinds of history demonstrating how Roman Caesars, Roman rulers, created their coins, struck their coins in order to make themselves look like gods. That's another story for another day. But Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. Jesus, in those words, are taking us back and taking the Pharisees back all the way to the beginning. Give to Caesar what is Caesar. Caesar's image is on the coin. Give it back to Caesar. He can have his coin back. You can pay tax. We can live in a society under the rules, even under unjust and unfair rules. But give to God what is God's. This should make us pause, because we need to remember in chapter 1 that God put his image on all of humanity, Adam and Eve. In other words, what Jesus is saying is that every person, everything, the whole of creation is God's. It all belongs to God. The things that we make and the societies that we build will last for some time, and we can find as good a place as possible within them. But again, the story of Scripture is God coming to earth to make his home with his people forever. Because God lives forever, God has made this creation to live forever, and he has put us on it to live with him forever. So giving to God what is God's is the way that we push back against sin and against the fall. If sin in the fall is all about claiming some other Lord or King or Master, orienting and directing our lives to someone or something other than God, then the remedy is all about reorienting our life back to God. And Jesus begins to show, not just in this story with the Pharisees, but in his life and death and resurrection, and in sending his Holy Spirit, Jesus comes to show us how we can do that, how we can reorient our lives away from ourselves, away from technology, away from whatever other idols we worship, but we certainly don't use those words, back to God. So as we close this chapter, I want to ask you, where are your allegiances? I said earlier, you are what you worship. Another way to say that would be, you are who you love. or what you love? Who and what do you love? Maybe you could take a few minutes and make a list. God has made a way for us in Jesus to live with him on earth forever. Following God, reorienting our life toward God, is how we push back against the problem and the sting of sin.